Chapter 18 of Susan B. Anthony by Alma Lutz. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 18 Social Purity. Militancy among the suffragists continued to flare up here and there in resistance to taxation without representation. Abby Kelly Foster's home in Worcester was sold for taxes for a mere fraction of its worth, while in Glastonbury, Connecticut, Abby and Julia Smith's cows and personal property were seized for taxes. Both Dr. Harriet K. Hunt in Boston and Mary Anthony in Rochester continued their tax protests. Much as Susan admired this spirited rebellion, she recognized that these militant gestures were but flames in the wind, unless they had behind them a well-organized, sustained campaign for a 16th Amendment, and this she could not undertake until the Revolution debt was paid. Nor was there anyone to pinch hit for her, since Ernestine Rose had returned to England, and Mrs. Stanton gave all her time to Lyceum lectures. At the moment, the prospect looked bleak for women's suffrage. In Congress, there was not the slightest hope of the introduction of, or action on, a 16th Amendment. In the States, interest was kept alive by women's suffrage bills before the legislatures, and year by year, with more people recognizing the inherent justice of the demand, the margin of defeat grew smaller. Whenever these state contests were critical, Susan managed to be on hand, giving up profitable lecture engagements to speak without fees. In Michigan in 1874 and in Iowa in 1875, she made new friends for the cause, but was unable to stem the tide of prejudice against granting women the vote. After the defeat in Michigan, she wrote in her diary, "Every whiskey-maker, vendor, drinker, gambler, every ignorant, besotted man is against us. And then the other extreme, every narrow, selfish, religious bigot." A new militant movement swept the country in 1874, starting in small Ohio towns among women who were so aroused over the evil influence of liquor on husbands, sons, fathers, and brothers that they gathered in front of saloons to sing and pray, hoping to persuade drunkards to reform and saloon keepers to close their doors. Out of this uprising, the Women's Christian Temperance Union developed, and within the next few years was organized into a powerful reform movement by a young schoolteacher from Illinois, Frances E. Willard. A lifelong advocate of temperance, Susan had long before reached the conclusion that this reform could not be achieved by a strictly temperance or religious movement, but only through the votes of women. Nevertheless, she lent a helping hand to the Rochester women who organized a branch of the WCTU, but she told them just how she felt. "The best thing this organization will do for you will be to show you how utterly powerless you are to put down the liquor traffic. You can never talk down or sing down or pray down an institution which is voted into existence. You will never be able to lessen this evil until you have votes." As she traveled through the West for the Lyceum Bureau, she did what she could to stimulate interest in a federal women's suffrage amendment, speaking out of a full heart and with sure knowledge on bread and the ballot and the power of the ballot, earning on average $100 a week, which she applied to the Revolution debt. Lyceum lecturers were now at the height of their popularity, particularly in the West, where in the little towns scattered across the prairies there were few libraries and theaters, and the distribution of books, magazines, and newspapers in no way met the people's thirst for information or entertainment. Men, women, and children rode miles on horseback or drove over rough roads in wagons to see and hear a prominent lecturer. Susan was always a drawing card, for a woman on the lecture platform still was a novelty, and almost everyone was curious about Susan B. Anthony. Many, to their surprise, discovered she was not the caricature they had been led to believe. She looked very ladylike and proper as she stood before them in her dark silk platform dress, a little too stern and serious perhaps, but frequently her face lighted up with a friendly smile. She spoke to them as equals, and they could follow her reasoning. Her simple conversational manner was refreshing after the sonorous, pretentious oratory of other lecturers. Continuous travel in all kinds of weather was difficult. Branch lines were slow and connections poor. Often trains were delayed by blizzards, and then, to keep her engagements, she was obliged to travel by sleigh over the snowy prairies. There were long waits in dingy, dirty railroad stations late at night. Even there she was always busy, reading her newspapers in the dim light or dashing off letters home on any scrap of paper she had at hand, thinking gratefully of her sister Mary, who, in addition to her work as superintendent of the neighborhood public school, supervised the household at 7 Madison Street. Hotel rooms were cold and drab, the food was uninviting, and only occasionally did she find to her delight a Christian cup of coffee. She often felt that the Lyceum Bureau drove her unnecessarily hard, routed her inefficiently, and profited too generously from her labors. Now and then she dispensed with their services, sent out her own circulars, soliciting engagements, and arranged her own tours, proving to her satisfaction that a woman could be as businesslike as a man, and sometimes more so. Weighed down by worry over the illness of her sisters, Guelma and Hannah, she felt a lack of fire and enthusiasm in her work. Anxiously she waited for letters from home, and when none reached her, she was in despair. At such times, hotel rooms seemed doubly lonely, and she reproached herself for being away from home, and for putting too heavy a burden on her sister Mary. Yet there was nothing else to be done until the Revolution debt was paid, for some of her creditors were becoming impatient. As often as possible, Susan returned to Rochester to be with her family, and was able to nurse Guelma through the last weeks of her illness. Heartbroken when she died, in November 1873, she resolved to take better care of Hannah, sending her out to Colorado and Kansas for her health. She then tried to spend the summer months at home so that Mary could visit Hannah in Colorado and Daniel and Merritt in Kansas. These months at home with her mother, whom she dearly loved, were a great comfort to them both. They enjoyed reading aloud, finding George Eliot's Middlemarch and Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter of particular interest, as Susan was searching for the answers to many questions which had been brought into sharp focus by the Beecher-Tilton case, now filling the newspapers. Like everyone else, she read the latest developments in this tragic involvement of 3 of her good friends. She was especially concerned about Elizabeth and Theodore Tilton, in whose home she had so often visited and toward whom she felt a warm, motherly affection. Her sympathy went out to Elizabeth Tilton, whose help and loyalty during the difficult days of the Revolution she never forgot. Although she had often differed with Theodore, whose quick changes of policy and temperament she could not understand, he had won her gratitude many times by befriending the cause. The same was true of Henry Ward Beecher, who had found time in his busy life to say a good word for women's rights. Susan was close to the facts, for in desperation a few years before, Elizabeth Tilton had confided in her. Unfortunately, both Elizabeth and Theodore had made confidants of others less wise than Susan. Mrs. Stanton had passed the story along to Victoria Woodhull, who late in 1872 had revived her weekly for a crusade on what she called the social question, and had published her exposé, The Beecher-Tilton Scandal Case. As a result, the lives of all involved were being ruined by merciless publicity. The Beecher-Tilton story, as it unfolded, revealed three admirable people caught in a tangled web of human relationships. Henry Ward Beecher, for years a close friend and benefactor of his young parishioners, Theodore and Elizabeth Tilton, had been accused by Theodore of immoral relations with Elizabeth. Accusations and denials continued while intrigue and negotiations deepened the confusion. The whole matter burst into flame in 1874 in the trial of Henry Ward Beecher before a committee of Plymouth Church, which exonerated him. Reading Beecher's statement in her newspaper, Susan impulsively wrote Isabella Beecher Hooker, "Wouldn't you think if God ever did strike anyone dead for telling a lie, he would have struck then?" When early in 1875 the Beecher-Tilton case reached the courts in a suit brought by Theodore Tilton against Henry Ward Beecher for the alienation of his wife's affections, it became headline news throughout the country. The press, greedy for sensation, published anything and everything even remotely connected with the case. Reporters hounded Susan, who by this time was again lecturing in the West, and she seldom entered a train, bus, or hotel without finding them at her heels, as if by their very persistence they meant to force her to express her opinion regarding the guilt or innocence of Henry Ward Beecher. They never caught her off guard, and she steadfastly refused to reveal to them, or to the lawyers of either side, who astutely approached her, the story which Elizabeth Tilton had told her in confidence. Yet, in spite of her continued silence, she was twice quoted by the press, once through the impulsiveness of Mrs. Stanton, who expressed herself frankly at every opportunity, and again when the New York Graphic, without Susan's consent, published her letter to Mrs. Hooker. The sympathy of the public was generally with Henry Ward Beecher, whose popularity and prestige were tremendous. A dynamic preacher, whose sermons drew thousands to his church, and whose written word carried religion and comfort to every part of the country, he could not suddenly be ruined by the circulation of a scandal or even by a sensational trial. Behind him were all those who were convinced that the future of the church and morality demanded his vindication. On his side also, as Susan well knew, was the powerful behind-the-scenes influence of the financial interests who profited from Plymouth Church real estate, from the earnings of Beecher's paper, Christian Union, and from his book, The Life of Christ, now in preparation and for which he had already been paid $20,000. Susan and Mrs. Stanton paid the penalty of being on the unpopular side. When Elizabeth Tilton was not allowed to testify in her own defense, they accused Beecher and Tilton of ruthlessly sacrificing her to save their own reputations. In fact, Susan and Mrs. Stanton knew far too much about the case for the comfort of either Beecher or Tilton, and to discredit them, a whispering campaign, and then a press campaign, was initiated against them. They and their National Women's Suffrage Association were again accused of upholding free love. Their previous association with Victoria Woodhull was held against them, as were the frank discussions of marriage and divorce published in the Revolution 6 years before. Actually, Susan's views on marriage were idealistic. "I hate the whole doctrine of variety or promiscuity," she wrote John Hooker, the husband of her friend Isabella, "I am not even a believer in second marriages after one of the parties is dead. So sacred and binding do I consider the marriage relation." Although in public Susan uttered not one word relating to the guilt or innocence of Henry Ward Beecher, she did confide her real feelings to her diary. She believed that to save himself, Beecher was withholding the explanation which the situation demanded. "It is almost an impossibility," she wrote in her diary, "for a man and woman to have a close sympathetic friendship without the tendrils of one soul becoming fastened around the other, with the result of infinite pain and anguish." Then again she wrote, "There is nothing more demoralizing than lying. The act itself is scarcely so base as the lie which denies it." Susan's silence probably brought her more notoriety than anything she could have said on this much-discussed subject, and it heightened her reputation for honesty and integrity. "Miss Anthony," commented the New York Sun, "is a lady whose word will everywhere be believed by those who know anything of her character." The Rochester Democrat and Chronicle had this to say: "Whether she will make any definite revelations remains to be seen, but whatever she does say will be received by the public with that credit which attaches to the evidence of a truthful witness. Her own character, known and honored by the country, will give importance to any utterances she may make." She was not called as a witness by either side during the 112 days of trial, which ended in July 1875 with the jury unable to agree on a verdict. Realizing that many taboos were being broken down by the lurid nationwide publicity on the Beecher-Tilton case, and that, as a result, people were more willing to consider subjects which hitherto had not been discussed in polite society, Susan began to plan a lecture on social purity. She was familiar with the public protest Englishwomen under the leadership of Josephine Butler were making against the state regulation of vice. Following with interest and admiration their courageous fight for the repeal of the Contagious Diseases Acts, which placed women suspected of prostitution under police power, Susan found encouragement in the support these reformers had received from such men as John Stuart Mill and Jacob Bright. Such legislation, she resolved, must not gain a foothold in her country, because it not only disregarded women's right to personal liberty, but showed a dangerous callousness towards men's share of responsibility for prostitution. She was awake to the problems prostitution presented in cities like New York and Washington, its prevalence, the police protection it received, the political corruption it fostered, and the reluctance of the public to face the situation, the majority of men regarding it as a necessity, and most women closing their eyes to its existence. During the winter of 1875, while the Beecher-Tilton case was being tried in Brooklyn, she delivered her speech on social purity at the Chicago Grand Opera House, in the Sunday dime lecture course, facing with trepidation the immense crowd which gathered to hear her. Even the daring Mrs. Stanton had warned her that she would never be asked to speak in Chicago again, and with this the manager of the Slayton Lecture Bureau agreed. But they were wrong. The people were hungry for the truth and for a constructive policy. In the past, they had heard the social evil described and denounced in vivid, thunderous words by eloquent men and by the dramatic Anna E. Dickinson. Now an earnest woman with graying hair, one of their own kind, talked to them without mincing matters, calmly and logically, and offered them a remedy. calling their attention to the daily newspaper reports of divorce and breach of promise suits, of wife murders and paramour shootings, of abortions and infanticide. She told them that the prevalence of these evils showed clearly that men were incapable of coping with them successfully and needed the help of women. She cited statistics, revealing 20,000 prostitutes in the city of New York, where a foundling hospital, during the first 6 months of its existence, rescued 1,300 waifs laid in baskets on its doorstep. She courageously mentioned the prevalence of venereal disease and spoke out against England's Contagious Diseases Acts, which were repeatedly suggested for New York and Washington, and which she described as licensed prostitution, men's futile and disastrous attempt to deal with social corruption. Declaring that the poverty and economic dependence of women as well as the passions of men were the causes of prostitution, she quoted more statistics which showed a great increase in the poverty of women. Work formerly done in the household, she explained, was being gradually taken over by factories, with the result that women, in order to earn a living, had been forced to follow it out of the home and were supporting themselves wholly or in part at a wage inadequate to meet their needs. No wonder many were tempted by food, clothes, and comfortable shelter into an immoral life. Her solution was to lift this vast army of poverty-stricken women who now crowd our cities above the temptation, the necessity to sell themselves, in marriage or out, for bread and shelter. Women, she told them, must be educated out of their unthinking acceptance of financial dependence on man into mental and economic independence. Girls, like boys, must be educated to some lucrative employment. Women, like men, must have an equal chance to earn a living. Whoever controls work and wages, she continued, controls morals. Therefore, we must have women employers, superintendents, committees, legislators. Wherever girls go to seek the means of subsistence, there must be some woman. Nay, more, we must have women preachers, lawyers, doctors, that wherever women go to seek counsel, spiritual, legal, physical, there, too, they will be sure to find the best and noblest of their own sex to minister to them. Then she added, marriage, to women as to men, must be a luxury, not a necessity, an incident of life, not all of it. Marriage never will cease to be a wholly unequal partnership until the law recognizes the equal ownership in the joint earnings and possessions. She asked for the vote so that women would have the power to help make the laws relating to marriage, divorce, adultery, breach of promise, rape, bigamy, infanticide, and so on. These laws, she reminded them, have not only been framed by men, but are administered by men. Judges, jurors, lawyers are all men, and no woman's voice is heard in our courts except as accused or witness, and in many cases the married woman is denied the right to testify as to her guilt or innocence. Never before had the audience heard the case for social purity presented in this way, and they listened intently. When the applause was subsiding, Susan saw Parker Pillsbury and Branson Alcott, fellow lecturers on the Lyceum circuit, coming toward her, smiling approval. They were generous in their praise, Branson Alcott declaring, "You have stated here this afternoon, in a fearless manner, truths that I have hardly dared to think, much less to utter." She repeated this lecture in St. Louis, in Wisconsin, and in Kansas, and while most city newspapers, acknowledging the need of facing the issues, praised her courage, Small-town papers were frankly disturbed by a spinster's public discussion of the social evil, one paper observing, "The best lecture a woman can give the community on the sad evil is the sincerity of her profound ignorance on the subject." Having bravely done her bit for social purity, Susan with relief turned again to her favorite lecture, Bread and the Ballot. Her message fell on fertile ground. These Western men and women saw justice in her reasoning. Having broken with tradition by leaving the East for the frontier, they could more easily drop old ways for new. Western men also recognized the influence for good that women had brought to lonely, bleak Western towns: better homes, cleanliness, comfort, then schools, churches, law and order, and many of them were willing to give women the vote. All they needed was prodding to translate that willingness into law. As she continued her lecturing, she kept her watchful eye on her family and the annual New York and Washington conventions, attending to many of the routine details herself. Finally, on May 1st, 1876, she recorded in her diary, "The day of jubilee for me has come. I have paid the last dollar of the Revolution debt." Even the press took notice, the Chicago Daily News commenting, "By working 6 years and devoting to the purpose all the money she could earn, she has paid the debt and interest. And now, when the creditors of that paper and others who really know her hear the name of Susan B. Anthony, they feel inclined to raise their hats in reverence." End of chapter 18.